7th and 8th grade, welcome to your final content week for Bible. I've been impressed with your learning over the past 5 weeks. It's been interesting. I've been grading some of your assignment that there's one thing that many of you have said multiple times. One way or another, you mentioned that you learned that it's okay to have doubts and questions. Unlike any other worldview, we serve a God who desires us to really know Him and welcomes us with all of our questions and doubts. On that note, I love the encouragement that Paul gives the Corinthian church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12, he writes these famous words. He says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully." So what Paul's saying is that now we do our very best to grow in our knowledge of God and to embrace the encouragement that He accepts us with our questions. But there will come a day we will see God face to face, and then we will fully know God. We will have answers to our questions. Now, how amazing is that? In the past 2 weeks, we've journeyed past the 6 major worldviews, and we saw that 3 of these worldviews are theistic. They center around a understanding of a God being. Then we saw that the final 3 center around a worldview that is humanistic. They generally believe that humans are the highest evolved beings in the universe. Now, our culture is increasingly running on this humanistic thought, and that changes how the culture at large views things. In these final few content days, we will discuss some sticky topics where we as Christians will find ourselves thinking and believing some very different things than the world around us does. Now, before we dive in, I do have to note, we are not talking about political party differences here. I did not grow up in America, and so I do not know nearly enough about parties, presidents, and primaries to say many sensible things on that. But we all know that there are Christians trying to live out their faith in different political streams all across the world. And so we're simply going to try to do is to understand what God's Word has to say about a few key topics, and then apply that to how we should respond to those same issues. Before we fully dive into these topics, we're going to take today to answer a super important question. What do we do when we disagree fundamentally with someone on a worldview level? Now, the chances that you will interact with a Muslim imam are pretty slim, but the chances that God will call you to lovingly interact with a homosexual couple, someone who had an abortion, or a diehard secularist is much greater. So the question becomes, how does God want me to live in a humanistic world that thinks and lives very differently than my Christian worldview would motivate me to do? Now, I love how author and speaker John Piper encourages believers to live in this world. He says that we are called to be winsome weirdos, and he pulls that idea from 1 Peter. Let's unpack what that means. So, how are we called to be weirdos? Let's be honest, that doesn't sound very encouraging. Well, Piper looks at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 and 4. And here Peter is writing to an early church. And he says that people are called to be surprised when they observe how Christians live differently. Let's read it. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3. It says, "For the time that is past suffices for what the Gentiles are doing, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatries. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them." Now, our lives should be very different than the world around us. But that leads to a challenging question. Does our worldview actually make a difference in our life? Does my worldview have a powerful impact on my choices, on my thoughts, and on my feelings? Or is my worldview just a bland, impactless label that I slap on my life? In the words of John Piper, does my Christian worldview make me weird to the world around me? So we have to be different. We need to be willing to be seen as even weird. That's not always easy, but that's very important if you want to fully embrace the Christian worldview. But there's another half to this challenge. We can't just be weirdos, we need to be winsome about it as well. In 1 Peter, we read in several places that we need to be incredibly appealing about living differently. Well, I could name a few verses, but let's just look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. Here Peter writes that we are to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. We must love people to the point that they are won over to the gospel. Now, we're a little weird about it. We don't necessarily love in the way that the world would expect, but we winsomely love nonetheless. Piper closes his argument with this challenge. He says that the Apostle Peter is calling for a special breed of people, not the kind of conservatives who give all of his energy to embracing and defending his weirdo status, the status that he is different than the world around him, and not the kind of liberal who will embrace any compromise necessary to avoid being a weirdo, but rather a breed that is courageous enough to be joyfully weird and compassionate enough to be zealous for good deeds. Your world, by and large, does not follow the same worldview as you do. Your bubble right now might follow to the beat of a similar worldview drum for now, and that is great, but it won't forever be like that. The world around us won't follow the same exact worldview until God's glory himself lights up the entirety of perfect truth for us in heaven. And until then, we have the call to be winsome weirdos in this world.